Welcome to The Blitz, a podcast from Coram Deo Church. The Blitz is all about tackling tough topics head-on at full speed. Are you ready?
Hey guys, it's Pastor John here. Wanted to offer a quick correction to this episode of The Blitz. Later in this episode, I reference a book on apologetics, and I say that book was written by Gerhardus Voss. That is not the case. I was mistaken and didn't have that down in my notes. The book was Christian Apologetics by Cornelius Van Til. And if you are interested in apologetics, it is a wonderful resource, a little thick to read, but would definitely encourage. But the correction is this. It wasn't Gerhardus Voss. It was Cornelius Van Til that wrote Christian Apologetics. All right, keep that in mind and hope you enjoy the rest of this episode. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time of the day it is that you happen to be checking out this podcast. My name is John. I'm the lead pastor of Coram Deo Church, and I am your host once again, which you probably expected because I'm always the host. And we're just not cool enough to have other people here with us. So anyway, someday. In the past, the purpose of the Blitz has been to deal with controversial issues, to try and speak clearly to these things, to talk about the things that people maybe don't want to talk about, but we need to talk about, and to try to address them from a clear biblical worldview. But today, we're changing things up a little bit, and I want to talk about the life, the ministry, the impact of Tim Keller. As I'm sure almost all of you know, on the 19th of May, he passed away. I had known that he was sick. I had seen that he had been released home from I think he was at a hospital. He had cancer, and he had gone home, and it was a sign that, hey, the end is near. And I think it was like within, 24 or 48 hours that I heard, I think I saw it on Twitter, that he had passed away. And so I wanted to take just a few moments to kind of reflect on that and to kind of bring you into, my thoughts and my experience, what it was like for me when I heard that he had passed, and maybe this will be helpful to you as you're thinking about it as well. So I was checking my phone over the weekend, and I saw the news that he had passed away, and I immediately got choked up. I was just kind of overwhelmed with a real sense of sadness and a sense of loss. Keller has had a profound impact on the church at large, not just in the PCA denomination that he was part of, but far, far beyond that. He had a voice, a trusted voice that was able to cross many, many denominational lines, and just a highly influential guy, a guy whose life that was, unlike many influential Christian leaders, free from sexual immorality or accusations regarding, money and greed and any of that. And, I just felt a sense of loss that the church had lost. I think what I posted was a giant, that the church had lost a giant. And what by that, I don't mean that the church is in trouble because Keller is no longer with us, but I mean, this is a guy who had impacted a lot of people for many, many years. And now he's gone. So certainly there's a grieving and a sadness for his wife. There's a grieving and a sadness for his kids and the friends around him, and the church that he helped to establish in Manhattan. There's loss and grief that they're all experiencing, but there was a sense of loss and grief that I had experienced as well, and it caused me to kind of just stop and reflect on the impact that Keller has had on me. And primarily it was in the early years of planting our church. We planted in 2004. And so I would say between 2004 and 2010 or 12, in that time frame, Tim Keller was one of the guys who really had a profound impact on the way that I thought about church, and I thought about preaching, and I thought about theology, and I thought about mission. And if I were to kind of just say, to write a short list of names of the men that God used significantly to influence me, and I would say to equip me, Tim Keller would absolutely be near the very top of that list. People that were influential was for me was Packer, in reading him in my early years. Of course, Piper had a huge influence on me. Mark Driscoll had an influence on me in my early years, and then Tim Keller had a massive influence on me. And so I wanted to share some of that with you, and I want to share it with you, knowing that some of you may be surprised to hear this, because in the last couple years, I've had some, I would say, somewhere between concern and confusion regarding some of the things that Tim Keller was saying, and I was vocal about those things because the things that he was saying were public; everybody was hearing them, and so I thought that some of them were at least questionable, and I had responded to those things. But that concern or confusion does not negate the deposit that he made in my life in the past. Now, just to clarify, this deposit was made from a long distance. I've never met him at all. I've never had personal interaction with him. I did get to meet John Piper once. And of course, because of proximity, had gotten to know Mark Driscoll a little bit, but never with Tim Keller. But yet, God really used him in some profound ways to shape the way I think. So I wanted to kind of just share some of that with you, to walk you through some of the ways that he has impacted me. And I think that if you're part of Coram Deo Church, as I talk about these things, you may be able to identify how those things that he taught me work themselves out in my own preaching and teaching ministry. So I'll start with the book that he wrote that was hugely influential for me, and that was The Reason for God. And The Reason for God was released in 2008. And one of the things that's really interesting about Tim Keller is that he intentionally waited to the later years in his life to publish, because he wanted to have time to acquire wisdom and understanding, and knew that sometimes youthful zeal can get book deals that aren't necessarily helpful. And so he was strategic in waiting till later in his life to publish. And the reason for God was it was a book on apologetics, and it was intended, it's actually written as a chapter by chapter, topic by topic response to the top criticisms or questions or objections that people had to Christianity. So there's issues like the exclusivity. How can there be just one way? And by the way, all these objections are birthed out of a postmodern mindset. We're really beyond that now, and so the questions we're dealing with now are very, very different in nature. But at the time, this was, I thought it was very helpful. So he's dealing with issues of exclusivity. How can there only be one way? He's dealing with the issue of wrath and judgment. How can a loving God send people to hell? He's talking about morality and dealing to responding to the objection that Christianity is just a straitjacket because primarily because of things like sexual ethics and standards and stuff like that. He responds to the objection that science has disproved Christianity or disproved the existence of God. So he's really taking these main objections to Christianity. He's taking them on, and he's taking them on head on. And in his book, he responds to each one of those. Now, I haven't read the book for years, but when I did read the book, I remember going, okay, some of these responses I'm not necessarily on board with. I don't necessarily think that's the way I would respond, but what his book demonstrated was that we as Christians, we as the church, can respond to these critiques confidently and with clarity, and we can do it intelligently, and we can defend our faith in a way that our critics can understand, right? We can do it clearly, we can do it with confidence, we can do it biblically, and we can do it in a way that those who are asking the questions can understand. And so that book, if nothing else, demonstrated that. And it introduced me not simply to apologetics, because there's multiple disciplines in apologetics, but it introduced me to a particular discipline, and that is the discipline of presuppositional apologetics. And when you read the reason for God, and when you read each of the objections, one of the things that he does every single time is he is basically exercising presuppositional apologetics, and there's a reason for that. So the reason for God, that book demonstrated that there are good questions, thoughtful, intelligent responses to the questions that people have, and that book kind of springboarded me to another author that Keller was actually drawing from, and that was a guy named Leslie Newbigin, who, if I remember right, was a British guy who was a missionary in India, and he came back to his homeland in England, and he saw what was going on culturally, and he was basically applying what he had learned in India in terms of mission and apologetics to his new setting. He wrote a book called The Gospel in a Pluralistic Society. And so what Keller was doing in The Reason for God was kind of a simplified version of what Leslie Newbigin was trying to do in The Gospel in a Pluralistic Society. And so I ended up falling in love with that book, and that turned me on just deeper into presuppositional apologetics. And from there, I was introduced to a guy named Michael Poyani, who is this spooky smart polymath guy, brilliant guy. And he also writes in the field of epistemology, which is how do we know what we know, which goes hand in hand with presuppositional apologetics. And then from there, I was introduced to Gerhardus Voss, who has an entire book on presuppositional apologetics. And basically what I was introduced to with Tim Keller, which was then reaffirmed with Gerhardus Voss, was that when you are preaching the gospel, specifically when you are preaching a text in the Bible, one, you need to anticipate the objections. You need to know how a non-believer is going to hear what the Bible is saying and understand what their objections to that text are going to be. Okay, so the first thing is you need to anticipate the objections to the biblical claim. Second, you need to identify and understand the assumptions that objection is based on, right? Every objection to a truth claim is based on an assumption. And so if you want to engage the objection to the truth claim, you have to also not just understand the objection, but understand the assumption that objection is based on. And then once you understand the assumption, right, in presuppositional apologetics, you don't just respond to the objection, but you go in to dismantle and to try to deconstruct the assumption. Because all objections to Christianity, they exist within what Keller called a plausibility clause. So somebody is thinking about reality and they're assuming certain things can be true and other things cannot be true. But as an apologist, you have to get to the core of that and say, why can certain things be true and why can certain things not be true? And you have to enter into that worldview and then begin to pick that apart and help the person see that the assumptions that their objections are based on, those assumptions aren't necessarily true. And there's a craft to this. There's a skill to it. And I think in The Reason for God, Tim Keller really masterfully demonstrated that skill. In Gerhardus Voss's book, Presuppositional Apologetics, which, by the way, get that book and read it. It is a little bit like eating concrete, but Keller is doing the discipline in The Reason for God. Voss is explaining the discipline, and it's harder to work through the explaining of it. But once you get through that, you're going to see really the beauty of what Tim Keller was doing. But that whole anticipating, identifying the assumptions that somebody has, that the objections are based on, and going after that, not waiting for someone to bring it up, and not just letting somebody walk away from a sermon or a lecture with those questions, but to actually anticipate, to address, and to try and respond to those in a thoughtful way. That's something that I learned initially from Tim Keller, because he did that in his book, The Reason for God. And in fact, if you listen to the early sermons, and the reason I say early sermons is I haven't listened to Keller for probably almost 10 years. I've seen a lecture here and there, but I haven't listened to. There was a time where I was listening to his sermons all the time. I wouldn't preach a series without at least listening to a handful of his sermons. Not that I was ever, copying material, but there was always helpful insights there. But I haven't done that for years, so I can't. And I know that he hasn't been preaching for years. But I will say earlier on, that was just one of the things that he was really good at. He could anticipate the objection. He could then navigate inside that objection. He could expose the assumptions the objection was based on. And he would basically leave the listener with the impression that the worldview that he was presenting from the scriptures was much more cohesive and made much more sense and actually aligned much better with some of the listeners' sensibilities than their own worldview would, and he was a master at doing that, and I certainly am not a master at doing that, but I credit him with introducing me to that, the importance of that, and being a model for how to do that. So I'll just give you one example of when I've done that in the past. Whenever we go through our Christmas series, there's always this claim, this amazing claim in the middle of the Christmas story, and that is the claim of virgin birth. And people who see themselves as being more scientific hear the claim of virgin birth, and they think, how in the world could I ever believe in a story that claims virgin birth? We know scientifically, medically, that does not happen, right? And so that can sound like that's a deal breaker, right? But so what I always try to do when that issue comes up is I go into an atheistic worldview that says everything came from nothing. There was nothing, and all of a sudden there was something, and over time that something turned into human life. So the atheistic worldview is that nothing, that human life came from nothing, okay? And so as an atheist, if you're willing to accept that human life came from nothing, you're accepting that premise. It is foundational to your worldview. If you're willing to accept that human life came from nothing, what grounds do you have for rejecting the claim that human life came from a woman, right? That's presuppositional apologetics. It is anticipating the objection, identifying the assumptions that the objection is based on, and then trying to dismantle those assumptions. And if we're being objective and honest, it makes more sense to say that human life came from half of the equation, meaning a woman, without a man. It makes more sense to affirm that than it does to affirm that human life came from absolutely nothing. if you can accept that human life came from nothing, then you have no grounds to reject the notion that human life came from half of the equation. So that's just an example of presuppositional apologetics. There's others that I could give you that I use from time to time. But anyways, Tim Keller was the guy who introduced me to that. He was the guy who faithfully modeled that. If it wasn't for Keller, I would have never been introduced to Michael Polanyi or Geerhardus Voss or presuppositional apologetics. And I really think that presuppositional apologetics are incredibly important. I would say if you're going to invest in any discipline regarding apologetics, I would say that is the queen of the apologetics. Do your work and invest in presuppositional apologetics and check out The Reason for God if you haven't read it yet. And again, there's answers in there that I don't necessarily like. I'm a little uncomfortable with some of them, but overall, I think that he does a great job of demonstrating presuppositional apologetics. So that's his investment in my life. That's a deposit that he made, of course, from a very long distance and indirectly. But without him, I don't have that. And so I'm incredibly thankful for that gift that he has given me in that department. The other area that I would give him credit for and say he, more than anyone else, made an investment in me, again, indirectly, influenced me in this area. And that is the ability to see Christ in all of the scriptures and to, as Graham Goldsworthy would say, to read all of the Bible as Christian literature. So like many people who grew up in the church in North America, we grew up thinking that Jesus was a New Testament thing, and in the Old Testament, God's one way, and the New Testament, God is a different way. And so the New Testament's all about the gospel, and then we end up saying the Old Testament's kind of about works. And so there's really a lack of continuity between the Old and New Testament, and I think a lot of us kind of just grew up with some of those default dispensational assumptions. And one of the things that Keller was so good at was preaching the gospel from the Old Testament. He saw Jesus everywhere. Now, I don't mean that he read Jesus into things, okay? That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the ability to see how every story, everything that's happening in the Old Testament is in some way, shape, or form anticipating, foreshadowing, and revealing Christ. All of it. And Tim Keller was really a master at doing that, of taking you through a text, weaving through it, and showing you how this text pointed us to Christ. He did it all of the time. And so if you hear his sermons, you'll see, specifically the Old Testament sermons, of course, you'll see how he does that. But early on, there was a series of lectures that he did with Edmund Clowney. And if I remember right, Edmund Clowney was actually Tim Keller's professor. And so Edmund Clowney taught Tim Keller how to do what Keller does. Edmund Clowney was Keller before there was Keller. And so what happened was RTS, that's Reformed Theological Seminary, did a series of lectures called Preaching Christ in a Postmodern World. And I want to say there's like 40 lectures or something like that. Most of those it's like Tim Keller does some of the talks, and Edmund Clowney does some of the talks, and then they do Q&A. And I think that might still be available on iTunes. If you go check it out, Preaching Christ in a Postmodern World at Reformed Theological Seminary, RTS. Those lectures I listened to over and over and over and over again, because every time I listened, I felt like I learned something new. I saw something in the text I didn't see before. And through Tim Keller's lectures in that seminary class, it taught me. At first, it developed a conviction that the Old Testament was about Christ. Now, if you're part of Coram Deo, you might go, well, duh, yeah, we talk about that all the time. Well, one of the reasons we do talk about all the time is because of these lectures that Tim Keller and Edmund Clowney did, because they make it so abundantly and beautifully clear that the Old Testament narrative, everything, even the law, the stories, the history, the Psalms, the Proverbs, they are all about Christ. And when you start to see that, I know for me and others that I've kind of walked through this, that specifically the Old Testament scriptures just come to life. They start to pop, and you start to see things. And there's a tendency to moralize the Old Testament, meaning that we've got examples for us to do. And of course, there is some of that in there, certainly. And it is a proper way to exposit an Old Testament text. However, if that's all you're doing with the Old Testament text, I think we're falling short, because these are the scriptures that Christ said testify about him. And once you learn how to read the Old Testament through a gospel lens, right? Understanding that this is a story about Christ, that Christ is everything that Israel was always supposed to be and everything that Israel failed to be, that Christ is the faithful Adam. When you understand those things, right? It just comes to life. And then the Old Testament becomes good news. It doesn't become a burden that you have to live up to. It doesn't become, just something that is constantly reminding you of how terrible we all are, but you start to see and hear and enjoy the gospel from the Old Testament text. And I think that in terms of feedback that as a pastor that I get from our church, that's one of the things that people identify, that, gosh, it's always about the scriptures and it's always about the gospel, and the Old Testament is so exciting because we see Christ in it. Guys, that all comes from those early years of me listening to Keller and to listening to those lectures with Edmund Clowney. That was a huge influence that Tim Keller made on me that still sticks with me today. And if you're interested in that, I would say go listen to those lectures. Again, there's like 40 of them. If you're a book person, I would grab Graham Goldsworthy's book. Goldsworthy is his last name. He wrote a book called The Gospel Trilogy, which is it's about the kingdom in the Old Testament, it's about Jesus in the Proverbs, and it's also about Jesus in Revelation. That's a great book. And there's another book that he wrote called According to Plan, which helps you see how the scriptures, the Old and New Testament, are one story that's all about Christ. Those resources are really helpful, but the person that introduced me to that, and the person that made the most significant impact on my life in terms of seeing Christ in all of the scriptures and having a conviction that this was the proper way to handle the scriptures, that came from Tim Keller. And so as I look at just my own development and maturing and growth as a Bible thinker and a Bible preacher and teacher, man, Tim Keller had a huge influence on me. He's the guy I credit with introducing me to presuppositional apologetics, which is something that shapes every single sermon I've ever preached. And he's the guy that introduced me to this idea that all of the scriptures were about Christ. And that has had a profound impact on my own theology, on the way, again, I preach and teach. And both of those have had a huge impact on the church where I pastor. And if you're part of our church, those are probably things that you can identify, that you have noticed and picked up on. And all that comes from that comes from Tim Keller. So I am very thankful for his ministry. I'm very thankful for the things that I learned from him, that I learned through him. Yes, in his later years, there's things that he said that had me scratching my head, things that I thought were at least confusing and perhaps concerning. But, I was thinking about that this weekend as I was, reflecting on his life and his passing. And I think one of the things that led Tim Keller to say certain things that I was uncomfortable with is that he saw himself as an evangelist. And evangelists function differently than like theologians do. And evangelists tend to push boundaries sometimes that can make us uncomfortable. And I think that when Keller was saying things that I thought were concerning or confusing, I think that he was maybe leaning into that cultural evangelist thing a little too much. And that's why he would say certain things. And again, I'm speculating here. I don't know. But what I do know is that the things that I shared earlier, presuppositional apologetics and seeing Christ in all of scriptures, man, those are good, holy, God-honoring, fruitful disciplines that he was great at. They were his strengths, and they're things that I am thankful to have learned from him, and I'm thankful for that deposit that he made in my life. And I genuinely, it is sad to see him go. In 1 Thessalonians, Paul talks about we don't grieve as people who have no hope. And so there isn't a hopelessness for him or his family or for the future of the church, but there really is a grieving. We really did lose someone special. And like I said earlier, the things that he said later on that were confusing, those things are there. But that doesn't negate the good investment that he made into my life and in the life of countless other people. There are no doubt thousands and thousands and thousands of people who confess Christ as Lord today, and they would trace that transformation back to the preaching and teaching of Tim Keller. And so I am incredibly grateful for him. Think that you should be grateful for him. I think that we still have a lot to learn from some of the things that he left behind, and hope that will be a gift to the church moving on. So Tim Keller, thanks for your work, and thanks for those gifts that you left for me. All right, that's it for this episode of The Blitz. Thanks for hanging out. I know this one is a little bit longer, and the focus is a little bit different, but I felt like I wanted to share some of that with you guys. Hope that you're encouraged by it, and until next time, take care.